Good afternoon, class. So today we are talking about film production or the business of film production. Here are some important definitions. So first and foremost, we have blockbuster. So blockbuster is a film that has made at least $200 million in domestic box office. So again, it's a film that has made at least $200 million in domestic box office, and domestic referring to the United States and Canada. Majors are the studio distributors that control the industry. So again, the studio distributors that control the industries. Studio specialty are studio-owned art divisions that produce art films. These films are intended for an adult audience. So, for instance, like a Fox Searchlight or a Sony Pictures Classic would be an example of a studio specialty. Independents are companies that are not owned by a major. So it's like an A24 or maybe a Lionsgate, right? Again, companies that are not owned by a major. Film production companies produce films, they hire the actors, they hire the directors, they hire the writers, they make the content. Film distribution companies, so they circulate and promote films. So they circulate and promote films. So there's two different divisions within the motion picture industry. So there are companies that produce content, and then there's companies that promote and distribute content. Independent producers or producer, a person who works outside of the studio system, a person who works outside the studio system. Most producers operate outside the studio system. So again, most producers operate outside the studio system. These people often operate their own production company. Again, these people often operate their own production company. Talent agent, a person who represents actors, writers, directors, producers. They are considered to be the new brokers in the industry. So a person who represents actors, writers, directors, producers, they are the new power brokers in the industry. So if you want to make a lot of money working in Hollywood, talent agent is the way to go nowadays. Green light. So green light is when production and distribution executives agree to produce a film. So again, green light, it's when production and distribution executives agree to produce a film. Track record, a series of successes or a series of failures. So again, it's a series of successes or a series of failures. A distributor will look at a director or producer or actor or writer's track record to see if they want to greenlight a project. So again, a distributor will look at a director, a producer, an actor, a writer's track record to see if they want to greenlight a project. Negative cost. Negative cost is the total cost of making that first negative or film. Again, it's the total cost of making that first negative or film. It's comprised of 4 parts. The 4 parts are development, pre-production, production, and post-production. So again, negative cost, the total cost of making that first negative, because when you make a film, you're shooting it on a negative. That's why they call it a negative cost. It comprises of 4 parts, which is development, pre-production, production, and post-production. The last definition on here, which is product placement, is when a company gives or pays a producer to place their product in a film. It's when a company gives or pays a producer to place their product in a film. It's important from the producer side, film producer side, because it helps to lower the production costs of the film. On the company side, it helps the company promote their product. So again, it's important from the film producer side because it lowers the production cost of the film, and it's important from the company side, the company that's placing the products in the movie, because it helps them promote their products because they're using the film to promote their products. A little bit about the history of film production. Who was the inventor of motion picture technology in terms of like just inventing the camera? That's what I'm referring to, is Thomas Edison. So without Thomas Edison developing the camera, there would not be the technology to produce movies. Now, a little bit later on, after he develops the camera, Thomas Edison creates a partnership with Eastman Kodak. And Eastman Kodak and Thomas Edison created this very powerful trust called the Edison Trust. It was known as the Edison Trust. The company they created, the name was Motion Pictures Patent Company. So again, it's called Motion Pictures Patent Company, and it was known as the Edison Trust. And this trust essentially would charge a $2 tax for all film producers who wanted to, let's say, use the camera or use the film, or any film exchanges, in other words, right? Film exchanges was the early name for distributors. So if a distributor wanted to distribute a film, let's say, throughout the Midwest, for every film exchange, they had to pay $2 to Kodak and to Edison, as well as all exhibitors. Every time an exhibitor played the movie, it was a $2 tax. And so that's obviously a lot of money at the time. And so, this was one of the early trusts in motion picture history. They became very, very powerful. And Carl Laemmle was an early Nickelodeon owner. Nickelodeon refers to the fact that you could pay a nickel to enter a movie. And so he also was one of the first people to produce movies, one of the early film producers, independent film producers. And he also owned a film exchange in the Midwest, I believe. And so Carl Laemmle, who also, by the way, created something called the star system. And the star system essentially was, what Carl Laemmle did was he basically started to use actors and actresses' names to promote movies. This is the reason why most of us nowadays, when we ask each other, hey, did you watch that movie? You might ask the question, well, who's in it? And the reason that you ask who's in it is because Carl Laemmle is the person who started the trend of using actors and actresses' names to promote a movie. That wasn't always done. Carl Laemmle was the first to utilize the star system. And he also used the Supreme Court and the courts to take away power from the Edison Trust. And so what I mean by using the star system and publicizing the Edison Trust had, not a monopoly, but they would employ most of the big stars and starlets at the time. And so what Laemmle did to attract them over so he could use them in his movies, he would say, listen, I'm going to promote you in this particular movie. And so he helped make them big stars. And he also used the courts, again, to take away their power. So eventually the Supreme Court ruled that the Edison Trust had to be dismantled. This partnership between Eastman Kodak and Thomas Edison essentially gets dismantled by the courts or through the courts. So Carl Laemmle helps to end the trust. Carl Laemmle, a very important person in the world of not only movies, but in the world of theme parks as well. And we'll talk about him in the next slide.
Carl Laemmle loved ceremony and he loved people. He knew what people wanted. By the time he formed Universal, he was 40 years old. But Laemmle created something that would last forever.
Laemmle was born in Germany in 1867. When he was 17, he persuaded his father that his future lay in America. And so he bought himself a ticket to come to the United States.
Like the story of so many other immigrants, just had a couple bucks in his pocket. But he held down a number of odd jobs and finally became established in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And it was on a trip from Oshkosh to Chicago in 1906 that Carl Laemmle saw his first Nickelodeon.
He watched as people were lining up to pay nickels to go into this new thing called a Nickelodeon. And he counted the number of people going in, figured out what the rent would be, and realized he was in the wrong business.
In time, he not only was one of the biggest owners of Nickelodeons and movie theaters, he was one of the biggest exchange owners in the Midwest and the United States. Like many other founding moguls, he began to look at production.
He formed a company in 1909 called the Independent Moving Pictures Company and made his first film in 1909, a Western called Hiawatha, based on the famous epic poem.
Carl Laemmle partnered with 5 other independent producers to create Universal in 1912.
And the first film that they distributed was a film called Traffic in Souls.
And it dealt with the sensation of white slavery, kidnapping young girls and putting them into a life of prostitution, all shot on location in New York.
So it was a huge success. And it really was an indication that Universal could go for a larger audience.
It was really pioneering in its time. And Carl Laemmle was innovative in many ways.
Laemmle Sr. was one of the pioneers in the star system. He understood that movie audiences now wanted something more than just going to see a movie. What's the next attraction? Well, let's create somebody you actually want to go see and put the spotlight on an actor or an actress. He helped pioneer the large studio where you could do everything on your studio lot.
Universal had everything that a city had. It was all just a wonderland.
He was a real visionary. I mean, he's the one who saw the land in the San Fernando Valley and realized its potential for becoming a movie-making capital.
And then he became the first entrepreneur to actually organize studio tours.
They invited the general public to come to the studio and see how movies were made. They were able to do that because it was the silent era. So they encouraged the crowd to boo all of the villains and to cheer the heroes.
He was a showman. He understood that the show didn't just occur on the screen, but that Americans were fascinated by this new industry.
So anyways, please remember the importance of Carl Laemmle, a very important person in the world of movies. Later he'll become a very important person in the world of theme parks, if you think about it, because Universal City, right, Studios, eventually becomes a theme park where it centers on film production, but also on TV production. Film production. So as you can see here, there's many film production companies. 835 films were released in 2019, and only 329 films were released in 2020 in the United States and Canada. And so obviously COVID-19 has had a huge impact on film production in 2020 and certainly into 2021. So the market structure, what exactly is the market structure for film production? It's actually a monopolistic competition. So meaning that there's lots of buyers out there. There's lots of potential buyers for movies. So I know oftentimes we think of buyers as just being the Hollywood studios that are buying up movies. And that's true, they do buy up a lot of movies. But there's lots of different distributors out in the marketplace that also buy movies and release movies into the marketplace. Also, you have streaming services like Netflix that buy movies and release them into the marketplace. And so there's lots of buyers in the marketplace. So that's why it is a monopolistic competition. And so in terms of powerful guilds, there's lots of powerful guilds within the film production industry that protect the rights of the workers. So whether it's the Screen Actors Guild, which is SAG, or the Writers Guild of America, which is WGA, there's a West and an East. There's the DGA, which is the Directors Guild of America. There's also the Producers Guild. There's the Teamsters. There's all sorts of very powerful guilds that work within the industry to protect the rights of the workers. Because at one point in time in the history of Hollywood, employees would oftentimes get exploited by these studios or these powerful directors or producers, or take advantage of the workers. And so these guilds were created to protect the rights of the workers. So you need to think of film production as sort of being three different types of film producers. So on one hand, we have the studio producers that we're all aware of, like the Warner Brothers, the Disneys, those sorts of producers of content. Generally speaking, they make high concept or temple films. High concept is not really high concept, it's really a misnomer. Really high concept means that they are intended for everybody to watch. So for the most part, these sorts of movies make the bulk of their money outside of the United States. Sometimes high concept movies are considered what they call temple films. So, for example, they are movies that are going to improve the physical health of the studio. So, if you think about franchise films, like Marvel films would be an example of franchise films. A Marvel film can be considered to be high concept as well as a temple film. So, this is why I use the term high concept or temple, because in this case, they're sort of doing the same thing. They're both types of films are improving the physical health of the studio. And we'll talk about high concept later. Global distribution. So distribution, at least for the studios, is an oligopoly. So the movie industry has two sort of market structures. The production is the monopolistic competition, lots of buyers. And then distribution, you have a handful of very powerful distributors. It's considered to be an oligopoly. So this is where the Disneys, the Warners, the Universals, the Sonys sort of control the marketplace. There's a handful of very powerful distributors. And in case of the studios, they make the bulk of their money in distribution, in international distribution. So hence they try to saturate the entire globe with their movies. So they practice global distribution, again, they being the studios. Generally speaking, with the studio films, there's a high production cost, meaning that they're paying lots of money to writers, the directors, the producers, the well-known actors are making lots of money. Oftentimes, the high production cost doesn't always equal success, right? So they're spending a lot of money in movies, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee success. There's a great deal of risk involved with the studio movies because they're spending so much money on production costs. Studio specialty films. So these are also considered, they're also made under the umbrella of the studios. If you think about, for instance, say Fox Searchlight. So those are the art house movies for the studios. These tend to be edgier films or edgier themed, meaning they're not always intended for kids or even really intended for teenagers. These movies are intended for an adult audience. Generally speaking, these movies don't generate the kind of box office that a regular studio film would generate, or even the kind of box office that a high concept film is going to generate or a temple film is going to generate. So down here at the bottom, you're going to see independent. Independent films are distributors that are they're not studio films. They don't belong. They also don't make necessarily studio art house films. They're independents. They're not owned by the studios. They're outside of the studio system. If you think about Lionsgate, right? Lionsgate is an independent. They're not owned by a studio. They are not a studio specialty distributor or producer, I should say. Independents, right, are sometimes, sometimes they could be like a Lionsgate. In other words, they can make a big movie like a Hunger Game, or an independent could be just a type of distributor that just distributes art house films, or maybe they distribute documentaries. That's why you see varies. So an independent production company can make a big movie occasionally, like a Lionsgate, or they can make documentaries or low budget art house films. So this is why it really varies with independents in terms of what the kinds of films they actually produce.
budget. This prompted the sale of United Artists to MGM Studios shortly thereafter. Number 5. Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, Square Pictures. In 2001, Square Pictures, the film leg of Japanese video game company Square, decided to give Final Fantasy a big screen adaptation. The result was the $137 million animated epic Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within.
Well, nobody asked you to save me.
The film featured the voice work of Alec Baldwin and Donald Sutherland, and drew considerable praise for its photorealistic animation, but still failed to connect with a broad audience, taking in only a worldwide gross of $85 million.
That's your plan? We wait and see what happens?
Yes.
In fact, the underperformance was so great, it was enough to significantly delay a merger involving the studio's parent company with Enix. Fortunately, Sony Corp provided Square with some capital, and they recouped some of the financial losses thanks to video game sales. After the merger went through, only Enix survived, with Square Pictures becoming a consolidated subsidiary of Square Enix and Square Co. Limited dissolving.
Jane, do you mind if we stop talking? I'm trying to concentrate here.
Number 4. Titan AE, Fox Animation Studios.
See, the Titan was truly visionary. Most advanced ship in the universe. That ship has the power to reunite the human race, to give us a home.
On paper, Titan AE seemed to have hit potential, and it featured an all-star cast including Matt Damon, Bill Pullman, and Drew Barrymore. Fox Animation Studios looked to be on a roll, one that would hopefully allow them to compete with the likes of Disney and DreamWorks. However, Titan AE's massive budget, convoluted plot, and unclear demographic led it to being a massive box office bomb.
Yeah, well, who's to say it would have worked anyway?
Fox Animation Studios had been in trouble for some time, having laid off hundreds of employees the year before. Unfortunately, Titan AE pushed them off the cliff, and a little over a week after its release, the company shut down.
They let me live, provided I kill all of you before they get here. They should be here shortly.
Number 3. The Golden Compass, New Line Cinema. This studio had hoped to recreate the tremendous financial success of the Lord of the Rings film series when they put the Golden Compass into production.
Let's not be too hasty. The way I see it, there's no need for a dust-up.
Adapted from a popular line of young adult books, the film boasted a budget of $180 million, making it one of the most expensive films of the year. By the numbers, this gamble paid off, as the film grossed $372 million worldwide. However, that $180 million budget was funded by the sale of the film's international rights, with only the $70 million domestic take going back to New Line. This failure is seen by most as the moment that forced the studio's hand into merging with Warner Brothers, meaning that New Line would no longer be a studio that was separately operated. Number 2. Cutthroat Island, Coralco Pictures.
I knew you'd wind up here at some point. That being the cheese, and you being the rat.
Thing is, ma'am, I'm basically a shallow man.
You know you've made a horrible mistake when you file for bankruptcy before your movie hits theaters. Such was the case with Coralco Pictures, which filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection a month ahead of the release of 1995's Cutthroat Island. Intended to be the studio's comeback, the movie was not only light on star power, but was also funded by the sale of multiple films, including Stargate, which not only fared significantly better but spawned a massive television franchise. Cutthroat Island, meanwhile, made just $10 million against its $98 million budget, leading to bankruptcy and a sale of assets to French production company Studio Canal.
Success, Mr. Blair. My slave has found Cutthroat Island. Mark it on the chart.
Before we unveil our top pick, here are some dishonorable mentions.
You don't like that? You one of those bleeding heart types? Well, hey, cops kill poor people kill cops. That's the circle of life. Hakuna Matata.
I'm glad to see you.
I'm glad to see you too.
To Bora Bora and other romantic places.
Listen, isn't that my club sandwich there?
Yeah. Not anymore.
Hey, Lucas. Hey, anybody know what "wah" means? I think I just figured it out.
Number 1. Battlefield Earth, Franchise Pictures.
Does all of Earth look like this?
Oh, I'm afraid so, sir.
Pathetic.
Voted Worst Picture of the Decade in 2010 and winner of 8 Golden Raspberry Awards, Battlefield Earth is one of the first movies that comes to mind when you hear the words box office disaster. Based on a novel by Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard, the film was a longtime passion project for star and noted Scientologist John Travolta. Despite being turned down by almost every studio in Hollywood, Travolta finally found a backer in Franchise Pictures. However, the combination of a poor box office return and the fallout from legal issues surrounding the means by which the film was financed led Franchise Pictures to file for bankruptcy in 2007.
Maybe you were absent the day they taught economics at the academy, Kurt.
Do you agree with our picks? Check out these other great clips from...
So anyways, as you've seen, some of the worst box office bombs ever. Some of them were just poor movies. And sometimes, you can actually produce a good movie, but it just doesn't resonate with the audience for whatever reason. And so, that's the thing about movies. You just never know. It's high risk and it can be high reward, but that being said, it is high risk. So the second type of studio distributor, or I should say distributor, is a studio specialty. The studio specialty produce and distribute sort of studio art films. If you think about, for instance, let's say a Sony Pictures Classic or Fox Searchlight or something like that, they produce movies that aren't intended necessarily to be global films or for a global audience. Why? Because they're edgier themes. So for instance, it could center on, I don't know, teenage pregnancy, or maybe it's a very violent film. And so they know that the audience that's going to go watch it is limited. And so, but that being said, oftentimes these are the movies that are going to be selected for, Academy Awards in many cases. Then last but not least, we have the independents. The independents could look like studio specialty movies. In other words, right, they make adult-themed films. They're only going to reach, a limited audience. Sometimes they do produce what they call high-concept movies. Like if you think about Hunger Games, or I think about Lionsgate. Lionsgate is an independent, and so they produce. Well, I don't think they produced and distributed, I believe, the Hunger Games. Certainly distributed the Hunger Games, which became a huge franchise. So that's why I say independents could look like a studio specialty. But they could also look like a studio in terms of what kind of movies they produce, but then also distribute. So some key production budget components, it's the story rights, I should say, not the studio rights, the story rights, so the rights to produce. So this is where, for instance, right, the writer writes the script, and then how much is the writer going to charge you? If you need major revisions or just revisions within the script, sometimes you end up hiring what they call a script doctor. And literally, that's what a script doctor does, right? It fixes the script, just like it would fix our ailments if we're sick. So in this case, the script doctor is fixing a sick script, and sick in a bad way. And so they come in, they fix the script, and they get paid. Also, studio rights can encompass things like if you want the rights to a book or a short story or to a poem, things of that nature. Also, obviously, how much you're paying the producer, the director. If you're going to hire A-level talent, whatever that A-level talent is, like how much are you going to pay them? How much are you going to pay the other cast members? Something to think about. The production costs, which is, how much are you going to pay the, the person who's the cinematographer? How much are you going to pay the publicist? How much you're going to pay the people who are going to build you the sets? So all the crew, right? The production design, the studio costs, the people who are going to make the costumes, craft services in terms of like people who are going to feed you. Yes, that's spelled correctly. If you're going to travel to some location, how much is that going to cost? You know, there's all sorts of things that go into the line items to make a movie. This is why, generally speaking, making a movie is very, very expensive. Then, of course, after that, you also have all the post-production costs. So, you know, for instance, a lot of times you make for like sci-fi films or movies with lots of special effects using a green screen. Then you have to add in those effects later. Of course, you have to edit the movie down. So a lot of movies have hours and hours of footage, and you have to narrow it down to what, 2 hours or something like that. The color could be off, so you have to fix the color in post-production. Sometimes you have to do what they call looping or automated dialogue replacement, or maybe the audio didn't come out clearly, and then you have to bring in the star and the starlet back so they can re-record, and you have to synchronize their voices to the way the lips are moving on screen. There's all sorts of things that you got to be mindful of in post-production. As well as if you're going to be using music, is it going to be sync music or master use music? Are you going to hire a composer? So syncing means you're going to you're just using the sheet music, you're going to cover it. And master use license means you're using a master recording, right, of the artist. So you're using essentially the artist's voice plus the sheet music, which, you know, can be really expensive. So music is another key component in terms of the budget. Early production process, bear in mind, most things start out with a pitch, right? So in this case, a director, a writer, a producer is trying, well, I should say a director and a writer is trying to sell an idea to a producer or a studio executive. It could also be a producer who's pitching the idea to some sort of studio executive as well. So usually starts out with a pitch. And this is really good advice in the next step, just in terms of like, when you're doing a pitch, whether it's TV or whatever it is that you're doing a pitch to, this is what you should be mindful of.
I'll say two quick things. One is coming off what, excuse me, what Michael just said is the other fear that a lot of producers have or that other people have, or I won't speak for anybody else, that I have, is you're going to miss it. So there can also be the part of, is somebody else going to buy this? I better sit back and think through. Am I going to wake up watching TV and go, I could have done that show. Why didn't I do that show? Right? That has happened to me. So that's something to play with sometimes too, is this is such a good idea, someone's going to do it. I think it flows into what he's talking about, just knowing it's going to happen and acting like it's going to happen. But the other thing I would ask, and this is having come and done this conference, many other conferences, being a little bit recognizable for those people who ever watched the Project Greenlight or any of the other stuff, having heard a number of pitches in a number of very random places, is that you got to sit back and also remember that we don't have a magic wand. There is a lot of work that goes into getting something made. And you really got to sit down, if you're trying to help us out, is sit down and pitch it knowing what stage you're asking. So when you come in and you pitch and you say, hey, I just heard this idea about this cool man, woman, Charlie, who was a stagecoach rider. Help me turn that into something. Well, there's a part of me in the back of my head that's going, woohoo! That's a shitload of work, right? It's not that's good or bad. It's not that it's whatever. It's just like, wow, that's a lot of work. If it's, I have a script, I got this director, I have this cinematographer, and I got this one dude who will put up a little bit of money. Okay, that's a little bit less work for me, right? My uncle works at NBC, and he'd love to put this on if he just had a good producer. All right, well, let me talk to your uncle first, and then let's see how much work it is. But the point is that don't underestimate that it's a lot of work. And any of the work you can get done before you get to any of us makes it easier for us, right? And it makes it super hard when you walk in with just the idea or just the thing, because taking something from an idea all the way to the end is rough. And it's even rough, at least for me, maybe super easy for them. But for me, it's really hard. I mean, Manchester took 9 years, right? So you don't, we started with Matt Damon and Kenny Lonergan. So, it's hard. So just don't forget that when you're pitching people and this is the greatest idea. You should do this, as if we're just looking for 50 ideas and we can and there's a movie, right? It's hard. So just think that through as you're pitching and how far you can get and where you can do some of the work before you get to this moment.
So really good advice in terms of trying to sell your idea to somebody is also try to lay the groundwork, right? Help me out, because I'm not a producer, but help out the producer with as much work as you can possibly do. Second part is the green light. So that's to say that you pitch the idea to a studio executive and the studios like it. They're going to green light your idea. Basically what that means is that the production and distribution executives both agree to produce your movie, whatever movie that is. So PFD agreement stands for, first part stands for production, second part stands for finance, and the third part stands for distribution. This is essentially what they call a boilerplate agreement. So meaning boilerplate meaning basic. Doesn't matter if it's music, movies, TV, video games. Most entertainment industries have what they call a boilerplate agreement. Just so happens in movies are called production, finance, distribution. A lawyer should read this agreement, otherwise you might get, listen, you're gonna get ripped off anyways, but you should have a lawyer read it so you don't get ripped off as much, right? And so, don't bring it to Puente to read it. I'm not an attorney. But although students have brought me their boilerplate agreements for, generally speaking, music. But anyways, so the P part, again, is the producer's responsibilities. So it's his or her responsibility to attach talent to this particular movie. They're also responsible for keeping the production moving forward. In other words, you're giving X number of days to make this movie. This is why if you're going to bring in a script doctor to fix your script, he or she better work quickly, because the whole idea of rewriting scenes can be really, tricky. They're also they're the ones getting paid in terms of like, are they meeting the milestones to make the movie or get the movie done. There's always a production overhead, meaning that if you're going to shoot the movie on the lot, there's going to be a production overhead the studio charges you. I believe last I checked, it was about 15%. So that means if you're going to use any sound stages, if you're going to shoot anything on the lot, it's whatever the studio charges you plus 15%. You got to think of the studio as sort of being a bank, right? They're giving you money, but you're going to pay them back with interest. And so the more you use the studio, the more they're going to charge you. And we'll get into this when we talk about distribution and other things. So finance is the budget. So this is where the studio is telling you, okay, here's your budget. It's X number of dollars, right? And these are the penalties if you go over. So typically, like most credit cards, they'll say, well, if you go this much over, it's this percentage. If you go this much over, it's this percentage. So they'll as the more you go over budget, the more they're going to charge you an interest, generally speaking. Distribution is how many prints are they going to strike? So in other words, are they going to strike one print for your film, or are they going to strike 4,000 prints, 10,000 prints, 500 prints? I mean, how much are they printing for distribution? How are they going to divide the revenue in terms of for instance, what's the percentage of they're going to charge you for distribution? Generally speaking, it's between 30 and 35%, but it could be less, or it could be, even a little bit more, you're going to do a lot of foreign. So it just really depends. This is where, the distributor like talks about expenses. So for instance, to ship a print, this is historically speaking, would be an expense, right? To let's say take let's say pesos and turn them into dollars to exchange them back into US dollars, to currency. That's an expense. So what exactly is a distributor charging you for, right? They're going to list it all in D in distribution. This is why you need an entertainment lawyer to really read through this agreement very carefully, because any agreement's always going to be slanted in the favor of the distributor. It's not, generally speaking, almost never slanted in the favor of the producer. And so this is why you need to have, as a producer, you need to be hire a good lawyer who can point out some of the things that's going on here, because they do drown you in words. So overhead. So as I mentioned before, there's typically an overhead anytime the studio gets involved. It's about 15% production overhead. So to use any of their facilities, you're going to have, your production office on the lot. They charge you for that. You're going to use a sound stage. You're going to charge you for that. You're going to use any of their cameras or lighting equipment or sound equipment. They're going to charge you for that. They're going to charge you for everything that you use from the studio. They're going to charge you. Again, distribution is between 30 and 35%, but it just really depends on your agreement with the studio, but generally between that dollar percentage, meaning for every dollar that the distributor collects from the exhibitor, they get 30 or 35 cents of that. And then there's also marketing surcharges. So let's just say that you want the studio to help you market the film. They're going to charge you an overhead on top of that, about 10%. And talent payments. This is where it goes into, usually it's in the production part in terms of like where it lands. But payments, payments, it's either broken down to first dollar payments, gross or net. So the best way to think about it, right, is for every dollar that the studio collects, they're paying a percentage to the big stars. So think about the big stars that exist in Hollywood, right? So as I pointed out here, Dwayne Johnson is the highest paid, should be, actor, and Sofia Vergara as the highest paid actress. Somebody like Dwayne Johnson most definitely can certainly negotiate a first dollar. So for every dollar the studio gets, Dwayne Johnson's going to get, I don't know, 10 cents of that or whatever. And Sofia Vergara, well, I'm not sure if she can actually negotiate a first dollar, but let's just say hypothetically she can. Let's say that she's in a movie and, you agree to give her, she gets, 5 cents, 5% of whatever the studio collects. But most actors and actresses fall under the gross or net deals, right? Only a handful can negotiate first dollars. So gross means that they'll get paid if a film makes a profit before taxes. And then net deals means that they'll get paid if they're given points. They're going to get a royalty check if the movie makes a profit after taxes. Most movies, generally speaking, don't make money either gross or net. We'll talk about that later, but that's why these actresses who sign a gross deal or net deal generally don't get paid or get paid very little. Within the production, finance, distribution agreement, you're also going to have liability. So for instance, who's responsible for what? So let's say that, Tom Cruise breaks his leg or, somebody gets hurt during a production, who's responsible for it? If you blow up a building, who's responsible for that? If you blow up a house, who's responsible for that? Generally speaking, especially if you're, a first-time producer or you're producing something that's going to be high risk, for the studio. They're going to make you sign or find a completion bond or sign up a completion bond. Usually you have to sign this with the completion bond company. And essentially, this company is going to guarantee that you're going to finish the movie. Nowadays, especially since the Me Too movement, and I think this is a really good thing, mind you, is that most stars and starlets now have what they call sex writers. So that, in other words, if you have, let's just say, a scene that's sort of tricky in terms of like how much you're going to expose of your body, naked body in a scene, it provides the director with sort of like, this is what the star is willing to do in terms of showing off his or her body. This is what the star or starlet's not willing to do. And so this is a really good trend. It kind of keeps everybody on the same page, more or less. And again, you have to make sure that the director has reviewed the writer. You also want to make sure that the talent's representative, right, has reviewed the writer as well. Meaning the person that is representing the star, the starlet. So again, this is going to be really tricky when it comes to rewriting scenes because maybe the script doctor doesn't have privy to this sex writer, so it can be really tricky. So I guess the best thing that you can do to avoid sort of this awkward situations that could exist, right, between the writer, director, producer, and the stars is to communicate with one another, I would imagine. So break evens. So what do they mean? So obviously, actual break even means that revenue equals expenses. So, you know, like maybe your checking account, right? Maybe you made $100 this past week and you spent $100 this past week, which means that your actual break even is, or that you're at $0, which is actual break even. That's when revenue equals expenses. Now, there's something called contractual break even. That's when the producer and distributor agree that revenue equals expenses. So the producer and distributor could say, okay, we're going to declare that this movie breaks even when the movie makes, when the distributor collects, let's say, $100 million. Now, the distributor may not have broken even at $100 million, but they made disagreement with the producer, and it says in this agreement that according to the contract, that the movie breaks even when the distributor collects $100 million. So it doesn't, mean that it actually broke even, but according to the contract, it broke even. It's different from actual break even where, revenue equals expenses. And now where it gets really tricky is on rolling break-evens. This is where revenue equals expenses on a continuous basis. So let me explain after playing you this video clip of this commercial.
The world has changed. At this point, I doubt anything would surprise me. We are hopelessly outgunned. Mr. Stark. Captain, it's time. I still believe in heroes.
The Avengers. That's what we call ourselves.
Earth's mightiest heroes type thing. I have an army.
We have a Hulk.
Okay, so obviously you just seen like a super cool commercial on Marvel. I think it played during the Super Bowl. But let's just say that, for every movie, you always have, well, not every movie, most studio films have a marketing campaign that's being conducted while the movie is being released theatrically. So let's just say that Marvel movie was being played theatrically during the time of the Super Bowl. Let's say it's in February. I know it says May 4th, but so obviously the movie is making money theatrically, right? But it's also spending money on a continuous basis. That's why it's called rolling, or sometimes it's called a floating break even, is because as the studio spends more and more money promoting the movie, right, the break even cost rises, keeps going up and up and up and up and up and up. Think about when you're floating in a pool, right? You're floating up. And so this is what rolling break even means. So revenue equals expenses on a continuous basis. And the reason that studios use this, again, is because when a movie is playing theatrically, oftentimes it's spending money on billboards, on radio spots, on social media. It's running television spots. And so it's accumulating more and more expenses as it's generating revenue. And so rolling or floating break even means that revenue equals expenses on a continuous basis. But that also means it rises or elevates the break even. This is, again, primarily the reason why movies don't make money, is because, especially studio movies, is because they're constantly spending so much money in promoting a movie to make people aware that it's actually still in theaters. All right, so 5 sort of basic film financing and distribution deals. So hopefully I'm very clear with this. So number one is in-studio production and distribution. So in this case, you have what they call a studio producer, or somebody who's hired by the studio. And so sometimes you hear, for instance, in Hollywood Reporter or Variety, that this producer has signed the studio, or this producer is going to be working with the studio for the next 3 films. In other words, they sign like a 3-picture deal or a 5-picture deal, something like that. So essentially, the producer is now an employee of the studio, and it's his job or her job to come up with ideas for the studio. So in this case, right, an in-studio production distribution deal, you have a studio producer who comes up with the idea for production, right? He or she pitches the idea to some sort of studio executive. The studio executive likes the idea, and then that studio producer will pitch the idea to a few other studio executives, and they all agree that they should make this movie. So number one, essentially, everything happens within the studio. The idea happens within the studio. The pitch happens within the studio. The production, the financing, the distribution is all going to happen within the studio lot. It never leaves the lot, right? The idea started in the studio, never leaves the studio. So that's an in-studio production and distribution. Now, number 2 is a little bit different, but number 2 really is the most common. So again, number 2, most common. So in this particular scenario, we have an independent producer. So an independent producer is not employed by anybody, right? He or she is a free agent. They're out there. And he or she can pitch an idea to any studio or distributor. And so let's just say that they pitch an idea to a studio executive. The studio executive likes it, or maybe they pitch an idea to several studio executives, and they agree to do it. So in this case, you have the idea came from outside the studios. They didn't come from within the studios. It comes from outside the studios. The studios agree to buy that idea, to produce that idea, and to distribute that idea, right? So again, the big difference between 1 and 2 is that number 2, the idea comes from outside the studio, from an independent producer. All right, number 3. Number 3 is probably the trickiest. So number 3, let's just say hypothetically that you have a producer who pitches an idea to a studio. The studio likes the idea, but they're not willing to pay for production. They think that, maybe it's going to cost too much. Maybe they don't have faith in the producer. And there could be a wide variety of things going on where the studio says no to an idea that they like. And so, but in this particular case, they don't like the idea in terms of financing the production, but they're willing to pay for distribution if the studio can find a third party to produce the idea. So again, in this case, you have a producer, generally speaking, an independent producer. An independent producer has an idea. He or she pitches the idea to a studio. The studio says no to production, but tells the producer that if they can find a third party, like a bank or some sort of angel investor, a rich person, to pay for the idea, they're willing to come by and pick up the negative for distribution. So again, number 3, right? The studio is only willing to pay for distribution. The producer needs to find a third party to pay for production. So number 4, acquisitions deal. So under an acquisitions deal, producer paid for everything in terms of production, right? It was a passion project for that particular producer. And so again, producer pays for everything. And this is the kind of deal that you often hear at for film festivals, right? Whether it's Sundance or something else. And so they'll show the movie at a film festival, and a distributor will like the movie and agree to distribute the movie. So again, producer paid for everything. And in this case, the distributor is going to pay for distribution and agree to pay the producer for his or her production costs. So again, right, the producer produces the idea on their own. Film distributor likes the movie after it's done, agrees to pay for distribution, and pays the producer or recoups the producer's production costs. Number 5 is called rent a distributor. So for rent a distributor, you have a rich person like, I don't know, like a George Lucas or maybe like a Mel Gibson. So in this particular case, you have somebody who's really rich who can pay for production by themselves. They can pay for distribution by themselves. All they need to do, they being the distributor, is to distribute the movie on their behalf. So again, you have a rich producer like a George Lucas or a Mel Gibson. They pay for all the production. They're willing to pay for all the distribution, and all they're using the distributor for is just for their contacts. So the distributor is going to use their contacts to get the movie out there. And in return, the distributor is going to charge the producer less money. They're not going to charge them 30 to 35%. They're going to charge them, I don't know, 10, 15 or whatever they're going to charge them, because again, the producer is paying for everything. They're paying for, all the production and all the distribution costs. They're just using the distributor for their contacts or network. So some key jobs, I'm not going to test you guys on this, just if you're just curious on what these individuals do. Obviously, the director of photography, another way of thinking about him or her is a cinematographer. The line producer is one of the more important people in production because they're essentially the accountant for the production. You have the casting director who's in charge of casting for the feature film. In most cases, right, the major casting of the big star or the big starlet is done through the production, finance, and distribution agreement. But the rest of the casting, well, you need a casting director for that. Typically, you have a first assistant director who's working with the crew. Oftentimes, they'll be shooting the B-roll, right? The B-roll would be like, shooting that sunset or the moonlight, where you don't need the primary actor or actress there. Script supervisor keeps track of where you're at on the script in terms of paging, right? What page number you're at. They're the ones that are in charge of the hot set. They're also the ones sometimes you see like a empty coffee cup that shouldn't have been on the set. It's there. It's because the script supervisor didn't do his or her job. The gaffer is another person. It's another name for the lighting person. The mixers, the sound. You oftentimes have a set publicist who's hired by the studio in terms of letting access to the media, for instance. The photographer is really important because they can shoot stills of each and every scene. So that way, for whatever reason, if something gets moved, you can create the scene by looking at the photographs. The location manager is the person in charge of like where the different scenes are going to be shot at. Craft services, again, food. It's really important, especially for those of you who want to work in the film industry as either a producer early on and don't have a big budget. Always feed your crew. People are willing to overlook a lot if you feed them. And of course, you have makeup. And of course, there's, many more other positions within the world of movies in terms of production. And again, it's a very labor-intensive part of the business.